Welcome back.
Welcome to Decision Space, the only show to take place right here in the space between the turns in your favorite games. I'm Brendan Hansen.
I'm Jake Friedman.
This is the podcast about decisions in games.
And today we are talking about Puzzly games. And we have this designed as an old school decision space episode where we ask the question, what is a Puzzly game? If somebody comes to you and says, I played this game, it was very puzzly, we're going to try and dive in and see what that term actually means. And that's the deep dive discussion today.
And then if you're, as a listener, wondering, is puzzly even a word? No, it's not. It's not a word, but it's a word that comes up and people use to describe games, right? I've heard people say, oh, my taste is for puzzly Euro games. So in this episode, we're going to talk about what they mean when they say my taste is for puzzly Euro games. Well, aren't all strategy games puzzly? Well, maybe, but some are probably a little more puzzly than others. And what makes a game feel puzzly? And what are the characteristics of those games that lead to some people liking more quote unquote puzzly games and some people preferring less puzzly games. So we've solved the puzzle and we're going to get to the bottom of it in this episode. But before we do, Jake, a few weeks ago, we were wandering in the desert looking for an oasis of reviews. And in some ways, our listeners have provided.
Yeah. Thank you so much for answering the call. And we've had a flood of reviews, which goes a tremendously long way to helping our show get discovered by more listeners, which is amazing. So we want to say thank you to all 6 or 7 of you at this point who have left a review of our show since we asked. Please, please, please keep them coming. It's making a big difference for our download numbers across the board. So we'd like to read out one, and we'll keep doing so until we kind of exhaust them. So this one, it comes from E/S-17, and it's titled Obsessed. 5 stars. And here's the review. This is my new favorite board game podcast, a deep dive into games and topics that only come from true gamers. I've been designing board games since 2018, and I think this might be the perfect blend of entertaining, nuanced, and insightful conversations on board games. My only regret is not finding it sooner, because it will take me a while to burn through the entire library of episodes and amazing conversations. Thank you so much, E/S-17, for the very kind review.
Yeah, and I'm just relieved we're entertaining. I thought we were just, people gallivanting as fake academics and don't know what we're talking about.
True gamers rise up.
I got my stamp in the mail.
Your true gamer stamp?
Yeah.
I got it. Yeah, I laminated my card and stuck it in the wallet. What makes a game feel puzzly?
Okay, so as a jumping off point, we had kind of talked about this previously, but I want to talk of it, just throw out a game that can feel kind of puzzly as a way to start the conversation. And then we can go through these different qualities that we think contribute to a game feeling puzzly. And one game for me that can feel puzzly, though I think there's lots of ways actually that games can feel puzzly. And when people use the term puzzly, they mean a game has one or a few of these different ways in which a game can feel puzzly, but they're not always exactly the same way. So a game that came to mind for me as a game that feels super puzzly is Calico. Jake, have you played Calico?
Nope.
I know. It was rhetorical. But I asked this question in part so I can explain it to you and our audience. So in Calico, you have it's a hexagon laying tile game in which you're building a carpet trying to attract cats to come lay on your carpet. And on this carpet or rug, you have these different patches that have a shape and a color. So, or I guess it's a pattern. It's not a shape. And then you also have hexes on your board. Everyone has their own personal player board that have these different goals, like have 6 of the same color around this hexagon, or have 2 of this pattern and 2 of this pattern and 2 of this pattern. But the trick of this game is that they kind of touch each other. So how you accomplish one of the goals is affecting how you pursue another one, because overlaid on all of this puzzle is you're trying to get these groupings of tiles of the same pattern. And then also you're trying to get groupings of the same color. So you're trying to accomplish these 3 different objectives at the same time. And oftentimes it will come down to where there's just a single piece in the game, or maybe 2 pieces in the game, that will allow you to perfectly fulfill the criteria, much like finding the right piece in a jigsaw puzzle. So to me, Calico is a game that feels incredibly puzzly, trying to maximize points. Yeah.
I think I agree. That makes sense. And let's try and kind of pull that apart and kind of like parse the different elements of the decision space that creates that puzzly feel if we can. And I think one thing that stands out above all else to me when I think of kind of the experience of playing a puzzly game in the decision space that exists there is that there is some type of optimal play to be found. And I think in order to have that feeling, it means the decision space is really high clarity. I have a
Yeah.
lot of information to look at, and the unknown variables, right, are relatively few. So, for example, in a game like Calico, as you're describing, right, you're looking at the board, like what scoring opportunities are, what tiles you have out there, and it's a matter of kind of looking at taking in all that known information and then figuring out like what play is best. And
Yep.
if you compare that to something kind of like on the other end of the spectrum from like what I would call a puzzly game, would maybe be something with like direct conflict and like random dice roll, right? Dice roll to determine the outcome of a conflict, right? That feels a lot less puzzly to me because it's harder to know for certain in advance like what is optimal.
Right. Okay, so high clarity,
Help
not
me.
a ton of
Help me, Brendan.
uncertainty. No, I think you laid it out pretty well. You're sort of saying, Jake, that in games with high clarity, which typically is going to happen through low in output randomness within the game, meaning I make a decision, then something random happens. So you
Right.
gave this sort of troops on a map, dice rolling game. So I make the decision to attack this territory, then I roll dice to resolve the combat. That feels less puzzly because the outcome is uncertain than knowing I'll get another tile on my next turn. And I need to hopefully get this type of tile to do it. And I know I will be able to get that tile. Another way I think of talking about a game that might be a good example here that goes along with your sort of output randomness example is Can't Stop. Can't Stop is not a puzzly game in my mind at all, right? This is a dice rolling game where every turn you roll some dice and you move up some tracks based on the values of those dice. And then you decide if you want to push your luck and keep rolling dice or not. There's no real puzzle to solve. The heart of the game and the reason the game works is the tension around losing potential progress versus pushing further and trying to accomplish just a little bit more on your turn. And oftentimes I think in more puzzly games, as Jake said, these are games that are relying on search and finding the right move, or maybe seeing an optimal move within a large decision space. Oftentimes I think for a game to feel puzzly, there have to be lots of different things that you're evaluating from turn to turn where you're considering these different options and trying to find the best one. So I think it'd be hard to have a puzzly game where you're just picking between two things over and over again.
Yeah, I think that's definitely right. And I think that's like a telltale sign of a puzzly game is that experience of like searching through options, right? Like
Yep.
in Cascadia or some other kind of tile laying game, you might physically take the tiles and like try them out in different places to like search and see like that works. That helps me fill this. This one over here doesn't work. This one over here works even better. And that's just not something you have at all in Can't Stop, of that sort
Right.
of
Yeah.
trying on different things to literally see how they fit with your strategy.
And I think what we're saying here too, Jake, when people are talking about quote unquote puzzly games, where we're using this like colloquialism of alluding to the experience of doing a puzzle and using that to describe playing a game, partially we're talking about two things right now, right? I think people, when they're saying that, when we're talking about this high search, right, evaluating a lot of options juxtaposed with one another, you could take this tile and put it in sort of this configuration, or say you're looking at a game of Carcassonne. There's tons of different places I can put this tile on my turn. I have to search the board for the right place to put it. And there's probably a better place to put it. So I have to invest the time and find the optimal place to put it. That comes with like the search of maybe looking for the right piece in a jigsaw puzzle and sort of the feeling that you get from that, right? Evaluating lots of different options. And then I think the other one that you were talking about when we were talking about sort of finding you're having some reward for investing time for that search is it's not exactly the same, but I think people are saying that it feels like finding a solution to a puzzle, right?
Mm-hmm.
So not like a jigsaw puzzle exactly. It could be even like puzzles have solutions. They have right answers. answers. Games don't necessarily have right answers. But I think oftentimes what people say when they're saying a game feels puzzly is that usually there's either a piece that you could get if mechanically the game allows it. In Calico, maybe the right tile comes out and on your turn, and then you get to draft it. So it feels like you found the right piece, the right solution, more or less, because that's what maximizes your points for the board you created. Or you invest the time searching in, say, like Carcassonne, and you find the one spot that's going to give you 3 extra points.
Yeah.
And if you do that enough times, all of a sudden, oh, I've solved the puzzle of playing this game because I found the optimal solution in each of these decision points out of this forest of things to choose from.
Totally. Yeah, great point. 2 games that I've been playing recently that have this sort of eureka moment to
Sure.
them
Okay.
of
Yeah.
like solving the puzzle, at least within a given turn, is Tikal,
Yeah.
which feels
Oh my gosh.
puzzly, even though it has like high player interaction, right? And as I was saying, like earlier, that's probably something that's less often found in a game that feels really puzzly. But because Tikal gives you so much agency on your own turn through that menu of actions and 10 action points to spend, that you really feel the puzzliness of the game, especially in, maybe I should say the puzzle of the game, not the
Sure.
puzzliness of the game. In the scoring rounds, right? Where you're really trying to sit there and maximize the points that you're going to score that round. And, you might have a few different avenues to explore of, building up your temples, moving people to other temples, trading for different artifacts to complete stronger sets. And you might in your head, work through the puzzle of 2 or 3 different paths of, 10 action points sent until you find the one that gives you the most points. And that might not be the only thing you're thinking about on that turn, but by and large, like that feels really, really like you're solving a puzzle when you find that which of those paths yields the most points to you.
Yeah.
Similarly, a game we've both been playing a lot is Riftforce, and that can feel extremely like a puzzle as well when in the activation part of that turn where you get to choose, do I want to activate the elements that reflect the number of the cards I'm discarding or the type that I'm discarding, and which of those is going to give me the maximum impact on the board, and which card do I discard in the first place. Like all of that, I've been playing a ton of this game online lately, and all of that feels like you're really trying to solve a puzzle, and more often than not there's probably something you can find that feels like the best answer to the problem in front of you.
Yeah. And interestingly, I feel like in both of those games, not always, not every turn, and this is what makes them games, not puzzles. I mean, it's one of the things that does this. But oftentimes a good heuristic for both of those games is what can I do to score the most points on this turn, right? There's in both of those games, there's meaningful setup turns too, right? Where you're sort of
Mhm.
saying, okay, I could score this number of points in Tikal, or I could take this other move that's going to set me up for the back half of the game a little bit better. Is this the turn to build a new campsite and trade a piece of treasure away, or is this the turn to just maximize my points on the board again? And I think in Riftforce too, there's this tension between, okay, do I advance my position on the board and play more cards so I can have more options to activate, or do I just activate and hit the other player and try to clear some lanes? But both those do have, once you make the decision to sort of act, this real sense of, okay, I can find the right move here. And I think people might sort of be listening to this conversation and say, yeah, but Jake and Brendan, like, don't you do this in every game? Isn't every game about trying to find the best move? And I think, well, you're not wrong. I think what we're saying and getting at is this feeling of a disparity between the potential payoffs, right? So a game like Imhotep is this Phil Walker Harding game. And I want to hear, Jake, if you think that I'm onto something or if I'm leading us astray with this thought, because I'm not totally sure.
Yeah.
Imhotep is this game where you score, the average value of a turn is roughly 1 to 3 points. And you don't have a lot of agency over what's happening with your cubes. Each of you have your own personal player color of cubes and you're adding them to these boats. So on your turn, you're either going to add cubes to boats or you're going to send a boat to a location. If you add cubes to boats, you're essentially getting your color of cubes potentially onto a boat that will go to a location that you would like it to go. But other players get to, if they on their turn choose to send a boat, they might be sending a boat with my cubes, Jake's cubes, and Bridget's cubes. So it might not happen exactly how I envision it. So to me, Imhotep feels gamier than it does like a puzzle because there's so much uncertainty over where those boats will go, even though you could certainly, with if you took that element away, solve the puzzle of playing it. But I guess what I'm saying is when I'm playing Imhotep, oftentimes I'm not sitting there trying to puzzle out what the maximum points I can get on a given turn are because it's so uncertain what is going to happen with my play. I just kind of go off my gut of what I think other people are going to do and sort of try to set up what I think will be the best, but I can't find actually the best scoring option for me outside of sending a boat sometimes.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And it makes me think of a couple of things. I do agree that with your assessment, that some people listening to this might be saying, what the heck, because all games are puzzles to some extent. And I
Right.
think that is true. And what we're doing on this episode is not, reflecting on the fact that all games ask players to solve them, but that some games feel like you're solving a puzzle more like a tabletop puzzle type of feeling
Experience. Yep.
than this. And I think to your point about Imhotep, I totally agree. It doesn't feel like a puzzle, and I think part of that is, as we talked about before, you never really get any kind of eureka moments in that game, and I think part of that is that you have much lower agency, right?
Yeah.
When
Yep.
when you think about the Tikal and Riftforce example, those are games where you get to do a whole lot of actions and impact on the game in those turns where you solve the puzzle in front of you. And as you said, I think that both those games are more like hybrid games than like purely puzzle games.
Sure.
And I think at the end of this episode, we're going to talk about a couple games that feel to me almost purely puzzle games to an even more extreme extent. Those are just games that have like, they're almost hybrids, right? They have this big puzzle element to them, but also aspects of the game that don't quite fit into that criteria.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I think that, for a game to really feel puzzly, you have to have give strong agency to players so that they feel like they have the power to solve the puzzle. And in Imhotep, you're never solving the puzzle. If anything, it feels like you're like a kind of a co-conspirator with the problem the game is presenting. Like, I just want to create more problems for my opponents, with the way I'm playing that game. And I think that's the way in Imhotep, like, you kind of enact your agency and efficiency. It's like, if I put this block on that boat, then, when that player A sends it to the place that's going to be most valuable for them, it'll also be a big boon to me, and I won't have to waste my turn sailing the ship.
Totally. Okay, so let's talk. Maybe we can dial in on this even more because another element I think of what can make a game feel puzzly, we've kind of said that, high search, high clarity, typically low output randomness, finding the best move. I think another element is this emphasis on planning ahead. So in Imhotep, it can be really hard to plan ahead because your opponent's actions are so consequential. You can have a sense where I hope this is what happens, but you can't say for sure, on this turn, I'm going to do this. On the next turn, I'm going to do that. On the turn after that, I'm going to do that. And on the turn after that, I'm going to do this, right? And some games in Cascadia or Calico or chess is a really puzzly game. Even though your opponent has great impact on what you might want to do in a game like chess, I think there's a lot more forward planning that can happen. And I think that can start to make the game feel like you're solving a little bit of a puzzle as well, where you're linking together these sort of turns over and over. And Cascadia is a game where there's, I think mediums levels of search. You had mentioned like wanting to arrange your pieces in your terrain just right. And I think that's certainly, there's an element of that. But on a given turn, you're usually just evaluating 4 choices, like 4 things you can choose from, right? A matched terrain and an animal tile. So your search isn't crazy high of options to consider. It's medium, but there's a lot of forward planning. Okay, if I take this, then I need to find this type of tile, and I'll put it here, and then I'm going to get this type of tile and put it there. So all of a sudden, you're trying to solve, quote unquote, like sort of, I'll speak really quickly, solve the puzzle of what your whole board will look like multiple turns in advance. You're sort of doing this puzzle in your head as you're playing the game because there's enough certainty. My City comes to mind of another game that can feel like that. And that's a game where you're literally trying to fit pieces together on a board in front of you as efficiently as possible, right?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. That's a good point. The polyomino tiles are in many ways very close approximation of the type of literal puzzle box that you would buy and jigsaw puzzle that you would create on your table. You're trying to fit them together in an efficient way without leaving gaps. Patchwork, right? Great example of that type of thing where you're very literally solving a puzzle on your board in the exact same way that you would a jigsaw puzzle. I think chess is a great example, and I do agree with you that forward plan, the ability to forward plan is something I think when we define sort of like these topics and games or large categories, it's difficult often to pin down like it's exactly this.
Yeah.
But more the conversation is like a puzzly game is more likely to have these type of things, right? To
Yeah.
have forward planning, to have high search, to have high clarity, to have low output randomness, to have the eureka moments where you find the best decision on your turn. It doesn't necessarily need to have all of those things to feel like a puzzly game, but if it has three or four of those, I think most players would play it and get that puzzly decision space experience out of
Yeah,
it.
definitely. Well put, Jake. And I think that also how each of those things can be accomplished in the game isn't always going to be the same. So having high clarity might come in a few different ways. It might come from it being sort of a personal player space kind of multiplayer solitaire type game like Cascadia or like Calico, where that high clarity comes from the fact that, well, no one else is really going to be messing up my board so much, and I can make a plan and execute that plan. So I get that sense of putting the puzzle together as I envisioned it, versus maybe you have a more puzzly game like Carcassonne, where it has high clarity because each turn is so incremental in how it plays out. It starts to become clear how certain elements of the game are going to move and the sort of shape that's happening. Not enough is changing from turn to turn, and you're all kind of playing in this shared play space. So it's not ruled by these large sweeping changes from turn to turn, sort of how you had mentioned, Jake, maybe in a game like El Grande, where the board can change so much on a given turn that it doesn't feel quite as puzzly because it's not as clear. The clarity of what your opposing players will do can make the game feel like less of a puzzle because you can't solve for what those other players will do.
Yeah, yeah, well said. Should we talk about some of the like strengths and downsides to
Yeah.
puzzly games? Like, if you're a designer, why would you want to create this experience or like avoid it? And I think the flip side of that coin is like, as a player, you know, why might you gravitate towards these type of games or away from them?
Yeah, totally. I think the number one most obvious one that comes to mind for me, right, that you hear this in reference to things like Tikal, are a huge downside of games with high search. So we talked about high search being an aspect of puzzle games, is that you can end up with lots of downtime. If players are sitting there evaluating tons of different options on their turn, and other players can't really think about what they will want to do on their turn until the input of that player who went before them makes their decisions, then you just have a really long game that's not as engaging as maybe you would hope it would be. Tikal, Jake and I both really enjoy, and I think it kind of earns its long turns and its sort of luxurious decisions. But
It's in my
I
top
think
10.
it is. But that could be a downside, right? That they're pretty analysis paralysis prone.
Yeah.
Carcassonne is another game where we have people in our Discord. I think Aurora has said that when she played that game a ton in previous decades, her play group would they would show the tile and then they would all look for the best options because it would just make the game more fun to play it quicker and not just say like, okay, you spend the next 10 minutes looking for the solution of where this could go. Let's help you find the spots.
Yeah, I totally agree that, AP take analysis paralysis for players, long downtime for players is the biggest concern. And I'll even make a finer point on that, which is that this is something that can be really difficult to manage as you think about like the magic circle of your play group.
Yeah.
Because one of the challenges with that is that often these puzzly games, especially puzzly games that have a high search element, the longer you search, at times the better you can do. Where if there isn't an immediate solution to the best move to make on your turn after 2 minutes, and that's the standard amount of time that is
Yeah.
like given to search, which is a really long time to take on your turn, we should say, for most gamers and most games.
By standard in this case too, you mean the like group agreed
The
upon
group agreed upon, like,
nondescript social
yeah.
contract. Yeah.
Like when you say, sorry guys, I need to look at the board for a second to figure out my move. Most groups have an unstated sort of amount of time where eventually somebody will say, all right, come on, choose,
That's
let's
advanced the game.
go.
Yeah.
Right. And there might be a move out there that's just a better move that takes 5 minutes to find,
Yeah.
and it's different for every board state and every person. It's going to be a different amount of time to like find that move. But if somebody is more willing to wait and take time searching than the rest of the table, then they might be more likely to win the game. And that could just, as you're listening to this, you can probably understand that tensions could arise from that if you feel like you're waiting on a person and they're more likely to win these types of games because they're willing to, take up other people's time more so than other players. That dynamic gets really tough.
Yeah.
Which is why you see chess clocks, for instance, being utilized in competitive chess in some formats, and right for that very reason, right?
Yeah.
It's deemed like unfair and unbalanced if one
One
person
player.
uses 40 minutes of time to think on their
Yeah.
turn and the other player uses only 20.
Yeah.
And that we're not definitely not advocating for chess clocks in your game groups. I think that could create a whole nother host of problems. But I think that points to the potential issue with these high search games.
Yeah, I love too, Jake, that you kind of called out the potential for social conflict that can arise just sort of organically from playing games like this. And I think that's why I tend to prefer more puzzly games at two players often, is it kind of minimizes that issue. And oftentimes I can be on the same page with who I'm playing, or it's easier to sort of match. And the downtime matters less because I'm taking a turn every other turn rather than maybe once every 4 turns or whatever. Maybe we should talk about, so I think those are the real downsides. I think maybe another downside is oftentimes with games like this, you can end up, because there's typically lower output randomness, it can be harder for less experienced players to win, which can be a downside if you want to play the game with a broader group, right? If this is a really skill testing, if it's more likely that the better player is going to win, I can, in a game like this, it's harder for me to share that with a broader group than a game like Can't Stop, where maybe I'm better at the game, but my friend who just is playing it for the first time gets really lucky and has a chance. So it can be disengaging if you're amazing at solving the puzzle of this Euro game that you brought over and newer players just aren't putting it together yet. And maybe it starts for them to feel like their effort towards the game isn't worth it because they don't have a chance of winning.
Yeah. I totally agree. And I don't know if this is like a symptom of the analysis paralysis in these games or not, but I think also another social element to it is a game that is in general high clarity. You have a lot of information in front of you. It
Yeah.
can put pressure on you to make the right
Totally.
decision. And if you're constantly, losing to another player or other players,
It can make you feel
it,
dumb.
it can make you
Yeah.
feel dumb in a way that a game that has more randomness or just more opaque information doesn't, because whether, and this is not, I'm absolutely not advancing the case that like there's more skill in like these high clarity games than games with a lot of randomness. I think
Yeah.
both types of games can have just incredibly high skill ceiling for different reasons. But here it's you don't have that outlet of being like I got unlucky,
Yeah.
and your mistakes are probably more visible to other players as well, right? Because a lot of times with these high clarity games, there's a lot of shared information. If you're looking for the right piece to put a Carcassonne tile, the other 3 players you're playing with might just all see that like there was a much better place that you chose not to use because you didn't solve the puzzle fast enough or in the right way or whatever.
Yeah, it feels awful when everyone's sitting there looking at a position. And because you're playing a game and sort of the magic circle maybe is agreed upon to be competitive, uh, you sort of sit there, you're struggling to find the right move, you take your turn, and someone says, "Well, why didn't you do that?" And you're like, "Oh,
Right.
yeah, because I missed it."
Or somebody's like, I see a great move right now.
Yeah, right. Like, oh, here's some added pressure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I found it. Yeah.
Yeah.
I hope you can't. And there's times where that can be fun, but I think if it's happening too often, that can push players away from playing a given game. But yeah, I think let's talk about the upsides though too, because
Yeah,
there's tons of people who love puzzly games. I think us included. I really love playing puzzly games, and I think
totally.
that the sensation of finding the right move is really viscerally fun. Like that. The flip side of the story that I just told is that when you find it, it can feel like a slam dunk, right?
Yeah,
All of a sudden, you just get to spike the ball. That was a mixed sports metaphor, which I think we specialized in, or at least we used to. But that's a really exciting moment when it's sort of like I put in this effort, and then my reward is I score all these points because I found the right thing to do. That feels good. That's solid feedback in a game. You can be assured of your choices being right.
totally. I think there's a lot of advantages to puzzly games for sure. A big one for me is that these games typically are just better, or not necessarily better than on the table, but better than less puzzly games for asynchronous play experience. A
Yeah.
puzzly game is great to play asynchronously because each time you get a turn in the game, it feels like a satisfying snippet of the game. Whether you're taking time to solve a puzzle or like doing a different type of puzzle in Tikal or Riftforce where it's more of like a setup for a big payoff later, that can be really satisfying compared to Imhotep, another example used here, where it's just like, okay, I'll just like put one cube here and then we'll see
Yeah.
what happens with that in a few days. So having more to do within the confines of a unit of time in the game, a turn, really make a lot of these games sing asynchronously, which is not everyone's preference, but for a lot of people, it's a way that games fit into their life in a convenient way. Who maybe don't have as much time in a solid block for a game night or are more remote or whatever. There's countless reasons why asynchronous games can really rock for some people, and puzzly games are great there.
Yeah, I think another thing that puzzly games can do really well is the learning curve and sort of feedback that you get in terms
Yeah,
of improvement can be you can really feel it in terms of the scores that you get in certain games, especially if it's fairly low randomness in terms of even input randomness, where you can sort of feel yourself getting better. One of the reasons I think Maya and I played Cascadia more than 100 times was we felt ourselves getting better, and it was rewarding to get better and better at doing this puzzle in terms of so we wanted to win to beat the other player. That was certainly exciting, but I think a huge part of it too was just that we enjoyed getting better at solving the puzzle of a given game of Cascadia, and we found that as rewarding and interesting as winning a given game of Cascadia itself.
yeah, absolutely. I think related to that was sort of my next point, and I'm not sure if you'll agree with this too. And I think this will be again different for different people, but I think puzzly games foster a really rich and interesting conversation amongst those who want to learn and improve at that game in a way that's much more difficult at time for less puzzly games. And here's what I mean by that. If I'm playing a game of Riftforce, I could take a screenshot of my board and post it in our Discord and say, "Hey, what would y'all do in this situation if you're me?" and have a really robust conversation about the plays, the possible implications of that, and probably get to an optimal or best solution that's going to help me immediately learn and improve at the game. And look no further than chess puzzles, right? For another puzzly game that kind of like enables this type of sort of fun conversation about learning and improving. There's apps and books and like millions of chess puzzles that of all kinds of different difficulty that have been created that if you want to and are interested in learning that way, you can go to and participate with and interact with. That's a lot harder in games that don't share the elements that we find in puzzly games of like high clarity, high search, especially. Like without those factors, I think those conversations are a lot tougher, and it's a lot more difficult to ever kind of come to like best solution, right? Like the conversation just is inherently a lot more nuanced when those elements aren't present, right? Because in a different game, right, it might be a lot more like, well, that depends in like what's in your opponent's hand. Well, we don't know, so it's difficult
Yeah.
to find that kind of fulfilling post game discussion and learning.
Yeah, it's so interesting because in some ways I wonder, and I don't think these are exactly the same thing, but we're sort of having a conversation about sort of puzzly games and gamey games. I think it's the really blunt object, that word that I'll use to describe games that feel more gamey, like Can't Stop. In some ways, I think we're having a conversation a little bit about the difference between sort of mixed solution games and pure solution games. And what I mean by this is sort of like game theory terms, right? Of, is there an optimal move or is there not an optimal move, right? Where like chess is a pure solution game because you can find the right decision on a given turn, whereas a game like a fighting game, which is a genre that we both like playing games in, the right decision, it's a mixed solution game because the right decision, it's determined by what the other player does. And I think what we're talking about is sort of adjacent to this sort of framing of games, where Broom Service is a mixed solution Euro game because what's the right move on a given turn? I probably wouldn't share a screenshot with you and sort of be like, Jake, this is what my board looks like. What should I do in Broom Service?
Right.
We could have an interesting conversation of sort of strategically, you probably want to be moving in this direction to deliver these colors of potions. But at the end of the day, we can't have the same conversation we would have in Riftforce because it just depends on what the other player does.
Right.
So I do think that there's this element of these sort of puzzly games tend to be pure solution games. Right. Mostly there's a right thing to do.
We should say Riftforce is sort of mixed solution too, because we don't know what cards are in your opponent's hand.
Yep.
So the reason I wanted to jump in is just to say that I think the vast majority of board games that we interact with are mixed solution. But it feels like puzzly games are maybe 80%, pure solution, or like if there's a spectrum, they're way towards the pure solution side.
Yeah.
So you could say like maybe in Riftforce, you could be like, in 80% of situations, this is going to be your best play. That would be wrong if your opponent has 6 fire cards in their hand or whatever.
Sure. Yeah. Right. No, completely. Do you think that another sort of upside of puzzly games, Jake, is just also the fact that I don't know, for a certain subset of people, they just don't like their stuff being interacted with in games. Like, I want to do my own thing. And I think puzzly games typically facilitate a sense of like growth and progress without other people interjecting. And that's not necessarily like unique to them being puzzly games, but I think puzzly games oftentimes give that type of play experience that sort of people like. I've heard this type of player being called like a Care Bear at times, right? Enjoys. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
I don't know. I don't know if I'd go that far. I think like, to me, that's kind of pushing up against this thing where it's like a lot of puzzly games are lower player interaction, but not all of them. Like, I feel like Tikal and Riftforce are both kind of puzzly games that you definitely get your stuff messed with.
Yep. No, you're right.
Yeah. So, but I mean, I think like if you feel like you're somebody who enjoys like building up your own thing, then probably you're more likely to enjoy puzzly games, but not, it's not 1-to-1. Like it's like a Venn diagram with like overlap, like significant overlap.
Okay, I think we should close the show with talking about 2 recent games that we've played that are puzzly. But before we do that, Jake, I want to add a surprise segment that we're going to do in less than 3 minutes, where I'm going to read you games off that we've covered on the show, and you say if they're more puzzly or more gamey. What do you think?
Okay. I'm not sold on gamey term, but
yes, what's a better
for the
word?
Context of this?
More puzzly, less puzzly?
Yeah, I mean that's probably better.
Okay, we'll say more and less.
How about this? I'll do the slider and I'll tell you from 0 to 100% puzzly.
Okay,
so
okay.
Like, does that work?
Perfect. 7 Wonders Duel.
That would be 60% puzzly.
Okay. Architects of the West Kingdom.
That would be 30% puzzly.
Arc Nova.
This is hard. This is a hard game.
This is really hard. Yeah.
I would say
pretty puzzly.
I would say Arc Nova is 60% puzzly.
Okay, what about A Feast for Odin?
Yeah, I was thinking about this one earlier. Probably like 70% puzzly.
Yeah, it's pretty puzzly.
Yeah. But interestingly, like I don't think the worker placement, even though it's like there's a lot of certs there, like that aspect doesn't feel as puzzly as like the board part of it.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Blood
Okay.
Rage.
10% puzzly.
Yeah, not
Like
not super puzzly.
yeah.
Broom Service. Yeah.
Yeah, probably not. Probably, but maybe like 20%.
Okay.
No, maybe less. I don't know. Maybe 10, similar to Blood Rage.
Cascadia.
Cascade probably 80, 85% puzzly.
Okay. Cartographers.
90% puzzly.
Oh, super puzzly.
Would you say
Challengers.
so too?
I think Cartographers is super puzzly. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's almost all puzzle. A lot of roll and write games are hyper puzzly experiences.
Yeah. I think I wouldn't go like 100 unless it's like,
puzzle.
zero randomness.
Yeah.
Or something. Yeah.
What about Challengers?
Challengers is probably like 10%
10 or
puzzly.
15.
Yeah, like very low on the puzzly scale.
Okay, 4 more. King Domino.
King Domino is really, really high puzzly.
Yeah, it's
I
like
would
it's like
say
80%, 90%.
It's in the 80s. Yeah, in the 80s.
Yeah. Lost Cities.
Ooh. I think low. I think really low. Like
Interesting.
10%. What do you think?
I think it's low, but then you're also doing the puzzle of trying to no, it's low.
It's like it's like Imhotep low, right?
Yeah.
Which
because
Imhotep,
there's so much. Yeah.
Imhotep would be like 20% maybe.
Yep. Spirit Island.
Spirit Island really high.
Really high. That's a very puzzly game.
And solo game, or not solo, cooperative games in general are probably things that are more likely to be, not always, but more likely to be puzzly games. So yeah, Spirit Island to me feels like 90% puzzly. Like yeah.
2 more. Sushi Go.
Low, very low.
Yeah, it's just like
10.
10. And then finally, Zuvadis.
Zuvadis is zero.
Zero. Yeah. Okay, great. Okay, so do you want to talk about loot? This is loot with, I spelled it wrong in the name of our notes document here, Jake. It's loot with 3 O's.
Yeah.
Loot. Not
because
loot.
The
Loot.
O's are representing the 3 shields.
Oh,
or
cute.
something. Are they?
Yeah, and also I think it's called Loot because there's another game called Loot on Board Game Geek. So I bet they went and they're like, we want to call ours Loot, but there was already a game called Loot, so they're like, we'll add another Loot.
That's all. Yeah. So Loot is a game that is it even out yet? I think
it's
we were
not
playing
out
it.
Yet.
Yeah. Okay. So we were playing it like the pre-release mode on Board Game Arena, which is available to everybody. This is not like a decision space exclusive thing or our privilege. We're just, it just popped up on there. We saw Charles Chevalier and Laurent Escoffier, and we thought, hey, we'll give it a try. And basically what you're doing in Loot is it is an incredibly puzzly game where you have a bunch of Vikings. There's a central player board that has a bunch of resources on it. And then you have a personal player board that's mostly just open space with a couple of, I don't know, is this similar to the cat puzzle game before?
In Calico. Totally.
Calico. Yeah, where you have like a few pre-populated tiles that's like you want to surround this tile with these specific resources in order to get some bonus points. And then on your turn, all you do is add your Vikings of your player color to that central board. And whatever resource type you put a Viking next to, you get to take one of those tiles and add it to your player board. And then you get to take a separate tile that's like adding another type of
objective
goal that you're trying to surround with 3 different resources. So you end up creating kind of this tapestry on your board where what started out wide open now has like very specific requirements where I need to put axe right here because it's touching 3 different goals that all require an axe, and that's sort of like the type of efficiency that you're going for to put you ahead of your opponents. There's a couple other wrinkles, but that's the gist.
Yeah, imagine this game is 50% Calico light on a personal player board mixed with 50% Knizia tile laying game to claim tiles in a shared play space. And yeah, it's just so puzzly because you can forward plan really, really effectively in this game. And you also, in terms of uncertainty around what you can do, Loot gives you the ability to, on that shared sort of board where you're going to be adding Vikings to collect resources that you'll then add to your personal player board. By resources, we really mean hexes of certain types that you can add to fulfill those Calico-like puzzles on your board. We're trying to, have one gold hex achieve 3 different objectives that it touches at the same time. You also have these things where you can break the rules of the game, where normally you can block with other people's Vikings, but this one allows you to just place where someone has already gone. So in terms of agency, like Jake said, the agency is really high. And Loot is probably the most puzzly game I've played next to something like Calico. It might be even more puzzly than Calico, to be honest. In that, what I'm saying is that it's even higher clarity than a game like Calico.
Interesting. Yeah, I think the only way in which it doesn't feel 100% a puzzle is in that like slight player interaction on the main board where
Yep.
you can sometimes get in people's way.
Yeah.
But even when you can do that, the game gives you tools to deal with that exact situation that arises.
And it's a pretty big board. So
It's a pretty big
there's
board.
lots of options. I find blocking a little difficult.
Yeah, it can be difficult too. And it's the type of thing that if you're blocking, it's probably to your own detriment as well, unless you're just in like a really fortuitous situation. Or maybe you've built to a fortuitous situation where I can take what I want and block my opponent.
Yeah.
I would say it might feel less puzzly at 2 players.
Yeah.
We played most of ours at 3, where it's like, okay, if I screw that person over, then I'm hurting myself in them, and player 3 is getting ahead. Where if you're just playing in a 1v1 setup, then it feels like maybe the blocking strategy of like just going out of your way to hose your opponent might feel a little bit more viable. But yeah, I agree. I mean, we're talking about now because it's just a game that is kind of like your quintessential puzzly Euro,
Yeah.
and one that's coming out brand new this year.
So
What do you think of it?
I was really excited to play Loot because you mentioned it's by Charles Chevalier, who designed Kanagawa with Bruno Cathala, a game that I own and really enjoy, and a game that you own and really enjoy. That's also another fairly puzzly, but not, it's maybe a 65% puzzly game. And I would say, and Loot on paper seems like a game made for me because I really like this sort of Calico style personal puzzles. And I really like Knizia tile laying games that this feels directly inspired by. And in some ways, I think this Loot brought to the forefront for me that this can be really relaxing, really engaging game to play. Interesting decisions, a fun arc, but ultimately it never felt that exciting because the forward planning was so great that oftentimes I already knew when a big turn was coming, so I couldn't be surprised by it. And I felt like after I'd played Loot a few times, I'd kind of really seen everything that it had to offer. So I was happy to have played it and experienced it, but after 3 or 4 plays, maybe 5, it didn't feel like something I needed to go back to. How about you?
Yeah, I agree. I had a lot of fun learning this game in the first couple of plays. I really enjoyed it. And, for that reason alone, it's, an easy recommend to somebody to check it out on Board Game Arena and see if it's for you. But, it'd be difficult for me to, recommend going out and buying this game because I found similarly to you, once you kind of understand the puzzle, I don't want to say it's solved that I'm playing it perfectly, but it feels like my improvement happened rapidly, right? The
Yeah.
first couple plays, then I kind of understood it and was making smart decisions. And then I felt like I had plateaued. And I think that's another potential risk and downside when you're designing a very puzzly game is that, true or whether it's true or not, players might feel like they've solved the puzzle and then therefore kind of had their fill of the game if they have a couple of plays where they sort of succeed. In this case, success looks like filling up your whole board or almost all of it besides one space and achieving all the objectives. Like once you do that a couple times in a row, you're kind of like, is there a lot more here? Like, or did
Yeah.
I kind of like do it? And I think that just happened almost like too quickly, or like you said, right? So you can plan so far out in advance that like maybe if like the interaction and blocking was more onerous, like it would feel like a much bigger accomplishment to fill out your board than we were ultimately experiencing.
Yeah. I think juxtaposing that with this other game we've been playing a lot lately. So Loot's going to be a 2024 release. And that's on Board Game Arena if you'd like to try it. And then we've also been playing another Puzzly game, Nimalia, a game Jake just talked about in our last episode, which is this almost tableau puzzle builder where you have these cards that are separated into 4 quadrants. So a square card with 4 different terrains represented on it: grass, ice, water, and desert, each of which contain an animal, and then a few different objectives that tell you how you want them to be arranged. Whenever you place one of these tiles, they're really cards, onto your board, they have to be overlapping one that you previously placed, can overlap more or less, but at least one square of them has to be covering a square that was previously placed. And the objectives are different every time. Nimalia is a game that I've probably Jake is really it's snappy, it's quick, it's a fast game in terms of the number of decisions that you make. But I think it could end up on the table being quite puzzly and thinky because there's so many different options to consider in terms of configurations of how you can arrange the tiles, and then also where you can put them, and then beyond that, which tile you might want to draft on your turn that sort of has the same drafting setup as Calico and Cascadia. And I think for me, Jake, even though it's equally puzzly in its own way, Nimalia almost works better because it has for me, than Loot, because it's variable from game to game. And I'm realizing that Nimalia and Cascadia both really leverage the benefits of variable goals to make these games feel different from play to play, even when the arcs tend to be fairly similar and the forward planning can make it feel a little bit like a foregone conclusion when you kind of have a sense. Nimalia, I'm nowhere near as good at, so I don't have as much forward planning in that game yet. But it's really helping it keep the puzzle feel fresh and different, and making it rewarding to come back to play.
Agreed. Yeah, I'm a big fan of Nimalia, though I've been calling it Nimala this whole time. And I'm kind of like, now I'm kind of annoyed because Nimala is great because that's like an anagram of animal,
Oh, yeah.
but Nimalia is not.
No, I like your name.
So, yeah. So that's why I thought it was that. But anyway, yeah, it's cool. I think the Isle of Skye style scoring rounds is it makes it also like that. That's kind of what makes the puzzle for me engaging within the confines of an individual play. It's got the cool thing where in the first round you're only looking. There's 4 scoring objectives in the first round. You're looking at like 1 and 2, and then 2 and 3, and so on and so forth, which is great. I think also the drafting works a little bit better as well for giving players more imperfect information about what they're going to have on their turn. We've been playing at 2 players, so that gives you more agency, like more knowledge of what's coming back to you. But the by virtue of these cards just being like 4 different terrain tiles with either with each terrain type having up to 3 different animals on it, make these cards incredibly difficult to remember what they are.
Yeah.
So, with the when I'm passing 2 cards to you, I know I'm getting 1 back. It can be the only thing I'm really caring about trying to remember is like, okay, like both of these have a desert space, so I know I'm going to get a desert space back, and I could do this with a desert space
Yeah.
much more so than trying to remember like exactly the makeup of a specific card. But when you have 3 players, then that makes it you're getting 1 of your first 3 back. That's gonna be really hard to remember. And then with 4, then you get none of yours back, which
Yeah.
is I think also kind of great because that's what makes it more just make the most of what you're getting. And then I totally agree with you too that like having the variable scoring setup, it feels almost like a necessity for a puzzly game in this day and age. It's hard for me to think of like why you'd make a box that doesn't give this kind of option to players, because of course if you love the base game, there's nothing that tells you ever have to move past the suggested starting scoring objectives in Nimalia. But if you want to, you can. And now there's like, hundreds of different possible setups to give you a slightly different puzzle to solve each game.
I think there's a reason why Azul has a backside that's blank, and why
Right.
Cascadia has all the different variants of animals. But, there are puzzly games. We mentioned King Domino. Not a huge way to mix that up. It works fairly well. It's pretty different from game to game. My City has that as well. And I think that those games that achieve their variability through the pieces feeling pretty different when they come out and having that really matter. That it gives it enough variability.
I was thinking that with the loot, where if the type of like longboat tiles that you get, these are the tiles that you draft on your board as objectives. All of those show some combination of 3 different resources. If those were mixed up more, I think that could make the game a lot more replayable. Like, and there's no reason it couldn't be like have a group of any 4 shared resources touching this, and you get this many points. Like, if that's more difficult, that's fine, because you could just make it worth more. And I think like having a variety of different things you're trying to do, especially if you could kind of like pick for yourself what to go for, or having this starting boards that you get have more variety. Like, why wouldn't you want that?
Totally.
Especially because you don't have to use them.
Yeah, no, completely. So I think that's an interesting way to close. That's for the game we were just discussing. Again, that's Nimalia. And I think that, Jake, we both give a nice recommend too. I'd love to play that one more.
Yeah, it's fun, super light and quick.
Yeah.
I think the only like caveat there is like, if you're playing it live on the table, definitely could lead to some AP moments for some players, I would say.
It's only as quick as your slowest player.
Yeah, sure. Right. There you go.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, that's been our discussion on Puzzly games. We'd love to hear from you. Do you think we missed any characteristics of games that make them feel puzzly? Do you agree with our sort of spectrum of puzzliness here that we've kind of laid out on the show? And do you have a better word for the opposite of puzzly? Because gamey, I agree, is not really cutting it. If you do have thoughts on any of these things, come talk to us. You can talk to us in our Discord. There's a link to join that in our show notes and also on decisionspacepodcast.com. And Discord's just like a chat room that you can access in your browser where you can talk to other Decision Space listeners and us. And yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you all so much for listening. As always, we should thank Hembry for our intro and outro music. Reach out. See y'all next week. Goodbye.
Bye.